47 days, 29,000 men trapped, 22,000 shells raining down. By July 4th, half the defenders would be dead or dying from starvation and disease. The Confederacy would be torn in two. This is Vicksburg. The Mississippi River doesn't just flow through America, it defines it. In 1863, whoever controlled this river controlled the war. From Cairo, Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi was the Confederacy's spinal cord, pumping supplies, reinforcements, and hope between the eastern and western halves of the South. Abraham Lincoln stared at maps in the White House and saw one truth clearly. Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. Jefferson Davis, from his Confederate capital in Richmond, saw the same truth from the opposite angle. Vicksburg was the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together. Both men understood that whoever held Vicksburg held the war. The city itself seemed built by God to resist conquest. Perched on towering bluffs 200 feet above the river, Vicksburg's cannons commanded a deadly hairpin turn where the Mississippi bent sharply. Any Union gunboat trying to pass had to slow down, turn broadside, and expose itself to a gauntlet of Confederate artillery. North of the city, a maze of swamps, bayous, and tangled wilderness made any land approach a nightmare. To the south, the river itself became the Confederacy's moat. General William Tecumseh Sherman, after one failed attempt to take Vicksburg from the north, called it a place that could only be taken by a siege, and I did not believe we had the time, the men, or the patience to conduct such a siege. But Ulysses S. Grant did. For nearly a year, Grant had been trying to crack Vicksburg. He'd tried everything. He attempted to dig a canal across a bend in the river to bypass the guns. It flooded. He sent gunboats through serpentine bayous hoping to reach the city's rear. They got stuck in the mud and under hanging trees. He marched south through Louisiana swamps that swallowed wagons whole. Every approach failed. By April 1863, northern newspapers were calling for his removal. Members of Lincoln's own cabinet urged the president to replace him. But Lincoln, watching Grant's dogged persistence, said simply, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Grant had one last audacious plan. If he couldn't go around Vicksburg, under it, or through the swamps north of it, he would do something no military textbook recommended. March his army down the Louisiana side of the river, convince Admiral David Porter's navy to run the Confederate batteries under cover of darkness, cross the Mississippi River below Vicksburg, then march his army deep into enemy territory, cutting his own supply lines, and attack the fortress city from the rear, from the high ground the Confederates never expected to defend. On the moonless night of April 16, 1863, Porter's fleet of ironclad gunboats, wooden transports, and supply barges raised anchor and began moving downriver toward Vicksburg. Every light was extinguished, every engine muffled. The crews had piled cotton bales and sacks of grain around the vulnerable parts of their ships. For a brief, impossible moment, it seemed like they might slip past unnoticed. Then a Confederate lookout spotted the dark silhouettes moving against the water. Within seconds, every cannon on the bluffs roared to life. The river lit up like daylight. Shells screamed through the darkness. Porter's ships returned fire, their guns flashing red and yellow in the night. Wooden transports burst into flames, but Porter kept moving. When the sun rose on April 17th, most of his fleet had survived, battered, smoking, but intact. They had the transports Grant needed to cross the river. The trap was about to close. Grant didn't waste a second. On April 30th, 1863, his army crossed the Mississippi at Bruinsburg, 30 miles south of Vicksburg. It was the largest amphibious operation in American military history until World War II. 40,000 men ferried across a mile-wide river into enemy territory. And then Grant did something that made even his own officers nervous. He cut his supply lines. No wagon trains, no secure route back to Union territory. His men would live off the land, taking food from Mississippi farms and plantations as they marched. It was a calculated gamble. If it worked, Grant would move faster than any Confederate force could react. If it failed, his entire army would be trapped and destroyed. It worked. Over the next 17 days, Grant's army moved through Mississippi like a storm. At Port Gibson on May 1st, they shattered a Confederate defensive line. At Raymond on May 12th, they scattered another. On May 14th, they captured Jackson, the state capital, forcing Confederate General Joseph Johnston to retreat with his army. Johnston sent urgent messages to Lieutenant General John Pemberton, commanding the Vicksburg garrison. "If Grant gets between us, we're both lost. Attack him now." But Pemberton hesitated. His orders from Jefferson Davis were absolute: hold Vicksburg at all costs. Pemberton tried to do both, hold Vicksburg and stop Grant, and ended up doing neither. On May 16th, at a crossroads called Champion Hill, Pemberton finally confronted Grant with 22,000 men. The battle was savage. For 6 hours, the two armies tore each other apart on rolling Mississippi farmland. The fighting surged back and forth across the same ground 3 times. At one point, Confederate forces nearly broke through the Union center. But Grant, always at his best when things looked worst, threw in his reserves at exactly the right moment. The Confederate line buckled, then broke. Pemberton's army fled west toward Vicksburg, leaving 381 dead on the field and abandoning any hope of linking up with Johnston's force. Grant had done it. He'd cut the Confederate army off from any reinforcements. Now Vicksburg stood alone. By May 18th, Grant's army had driven Pemberton's battered forces back into Vicksburg's defensive fortifications and completely surrounded the city. Inside those fortifications were 29,000 Confederate soldiers, thousands of civilians who'd fled there for safety, and a commander who'd just lost the most important battle of his career. Grant now faced a choice: storm the defenses or starve them out. He chose to storm them. On May 19th, convinced that Confederate morale was shattered after Champion Hill, Grant ordered a direct assault on Vicksburg's fortifications. It was a disaster. Union soldiers charged uphill into a wall of rifle and artillery fire. They had to cross open ground, climb into ravines, scramble over felled trees, then assault walls 17 feet high while Confederate soldiers poured fire down on them from above. Within hours, the attack collapsed with over 1,000 Union casualties. Grant pulled back and regrouped. 3 days later, he tried again. On May 22nd, after an artillery bombardment that shook the ground for 4 hours, 3 Union corps attacked simultaneously along a 3-mile front. This time, Grant was certain they'd break through. The assault began at 10 a.m. By noon, it was clear this attack was failing too. Union soldiers made it to the Confederate walls in several places. One group even planted their flag on the ramparts, but they couldn't break through. The Confederate defenders, fighting for their homes, their families, and their last stronghold on the Mississippi, held every position. 3,199 Union casualties, over 500 men killed in a single morning. And Vicksburg still stood, defiant on its bluffs. Grant had learned his lesson. There would be no more frontal assaults. He'd take Vicksburg the old way, by siege. He sent word to Washington for reinforcements and heavy artillery. His army began digging. Within days, Union trenches snaked for 15 miles around Vicksburg's perimeter, a tightening noose of earth and artillery that would slowly, methodically, starve the city into submission. Inside Vicksburg, Pemberton counted his supplies and knew the truth. Time was now his enemy. The siege had begun. What followed was one of the most brutal sieges in American history. For 47 days, Vicksburg became a city under constant bombardment. Union artillery positions fired around the clock. From the river, Admiral Porter's gunboats lobbed over 22,000 shells into the city. The barrage never stopped. Not at night, not on Sundays, not ever. Each shell screamed through the air with a sound civilians would remember for the rest of their lives. When they hit, they exploded with enough force to collapse houses, shatter windows a block away, and send shrapnel tearing through anything in their path. The civilians of Vicksburg, thousands of women, children, and elderly who'd thought the fortified city would protect them, quickly learned there was no safe place above ground. So they started digging. Into the yellow clay hillsides that surrounded the city, families carved caves. Some were simple one-room shelters. Others were elaborate multi-room dwellings with carpeted floors, furniture, and even wallpaper on the clay walls. Union soldiers, watching from their trenches, called Vicksburg Prairie Dog Village. Over 500 caves honeycomb the hills. Families would huddle inside during the worst bombardments, emerging only when the shelling paused to cook food outside the cave entrances or fetch water from increasingly contaminated sources. Mary Ann Loughborough, a civilian who kept a diary throughout the siege, described the terror. We were at work as usual when a shell exploded not far from us. I ran to the entrance to see what damage it had done. As I stood there, another came crashing near the mouth of our cave. I stood paralyzed, expecting every moment that the next shell would tear through our refuge. One shell killed a child while she played in her yard. Another collapsed a cave, burying a family alive. About a dozen civilians died during the siege, with perhaps 50 more wounded, but every single person in Vicksburg lived with the knowledge that the next shell could be theirs. For the Confederate soldiers in the trenches, conditions deteriorated even faster. By early June, Pemberton had to cut rations. By mid-June, he cut them again. Soldiers who'd started the siege on full meals were now receiving a handful of peas and a piece of cornbread per day. Then the food ran out entirely. Soldiers began eating mules. When the mules were gone, they ate horses. When the horses were gone, they ate rats. One Confederate soldier wrote in his diary, "If you say rat to a Vicksburg man, he will smile and look on it as a luxury." The Vicksburg Daily Citizen newspaper, in dark humor, began publishing recipes for Confederate beef, which was mule meat. But starvation wasn't the worst of it. Disease swept through the Confederate ranks like fire through dry grass. Scurvy turned men's gums black and made their teeth fall out. Malaria produced fevers so intense men became delirious. Dysentery and diarrhea caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation killed more men than Union bullets. By the end of June, half of Pemberton's army was either sick or hospitalized. The trenches, dug into clay that baked under the Mississippi sun, became ovens. At night, Confederate and Union soldiers were so close they could hear each other talking. Sometimes they'd shout insults across the lines, other times they'd trade newspapers and coffee for tobacco. One Union soldier wrote, "It seemed strange to be shooting at men in the morning that you'd been joking with the night before." Grant, meanwhile, kept tightening the noose. His army swelled to 70,000 men as reinforcements arrived. He had Pemberton outnumbered more than 2-1. His engineers dug tunnels under Confederate fortifications, packing them with black powder. On June 25th, they detonated 2,200 pounds of explosives under a Confederate position, blowing a crater 12 feet deep. Union troops rushed forward to exploit the breach, but Confederate soldiers, starving, sick, and exhausted, fought them in hand-to-hand combat for over 20 hours inside that crater. The Union couldn't break through, but everyone inside Vicksburg knew it was only a matter of time. Outside the city, Confederate General Joseph Johnston had assembled a relief force of 30,000 men, but he never attacked. He believed Grant's army was too strong. He sent messages to Pemberton urging him to break out of Vicksburg and save his army before it was too late. But Pemberton's orders from Jefferson Davis were clear. Hold Vicksburg. Don't abandon the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. So Pemberton held, and his men starved. On June 28th, Pemberton received a petition signed by many of his own soldiers. It read, "If you cannot feed us, you had better surrender." The decision was no longer about military strategy, it was about survival. On July 3, 1863, a white flag appeared over the Confederate lines. General Pemberton requested a meeting with Grant to discuss terms. The two men had known each other before the war. They'd served together in Mexico. Now they met between their armies on a hillside overlooking Vicksburg, within sight of the trenches where thousands of men had died trying to take or defend this city. Pemberton wanted to negotiate. He hoped that surrendering on July 4th, Independence Day, might earn more generous terms from Grant. He was right, but not for the reasons he expected. Grant initially demanded unconditional surrender, the same terms he'd become famous for at Fort Donelson. But then he reconsidered. If he demanded unconditional surrender, he'd have to transport, feed, and guard 30,000 Confederate prisoners. That would tie up resources and slow his next campaign. Instead, Grant offered parole. The Confederate soldiers would be released on their promise not to fight again until officially exchanged. Pemberton accepted. At 10 a.m. on July 4, 1863, after 47 days of siege, the Confederate garrison marched out of Vicksburg's fortifications, stacked their rifles, and furled their flags. What happened next surprised everyone. Union soldiers, who moments before had been enemies, began sharing their rations with starving Confederate troops. Grant wrote, "The men of the two armies fraternized as if they had been fighting for the same cause. Union soldiers threw food into the streets. Confederate soldiers, some too weak to walk, wept as they ate. One Union officer wrote, "There was no gloating, no celebration of victory over a defeated enemy. There was only relief that the killing had stopped, and pity for men who'd held out far longer than anyone thought possible." The numbers told the story of what Vicksburg had cost. Union casualties for the battle and siege, 4,835. Confederate casualties, 32,697, though 29,495 of those were prisoners, not killed or wounded. For the full campaign since March 29th, the Union had suffered 10,142 killed and wounded. The Confederacy had lost 9,091 killed and wounded, plus an entire army. Grant captured 172 cannons, 60,000 rifles, and the most strategic position in the Western theater. But more than that, he'd captured something Jefferson Davis knew could never be replaced: control of the Mississippi River. 5 days later, on July 9th, Port Hudson, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi, surrendered to Union forces. For the first time in 2 years, the Mississippi River was open from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. President Lincoln, upon hearing the news, wrote, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The Confederacy was split in two. Texas, Arkansas, and western Louisiana were cut off from the rest of the South. The cattle, food, and supplies those states produced could no longer reach Confederate armies in the East. It was a wound the Confederacy could not heal. The timing made it worse. Just 1 day before Vicksburg fell, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had been defeated at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. July 4th, 1863 became the double blow that changed the war. Lee's invasion of the North had failed. The Mississippi was lost. The Confederacy, which in the spring of 1863 had hoped for European recognition and possible victory, now faced the grim reality that it was losing. Union General Sherman, looking at a map after Vicksburg fell, said simply, "The war is decided." For Vicksburg itself, the siege left scars that lasted generations. The city's residents, who'd endured 47 days of bombardment and starvation, couldn't bring themselves to celebrate Independence Day, not when July 4th marked the day their city fell. For 81 years, Vicksburg refused to officially celebrate the 4th of July. It wasn't until 1945, in the midst of World War II's patriotic fervor, that the city finally held another Independence Day celebration. But Vicksburg's military importance was undeniable. Grant's campaign is still studied at military academies worldwide as a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. The audacious river crossing, the rapid inland campaign that defeated Confederate forces in detail, and the patient siege that avoided unnecessary casualties while achieving total victory. Grant had proven himself to be something the Union desperately needed: a general who fought, adapted when plans failed, and finished what he started. Lincoln, who'd defended Grant against critics for months, finally had the commander who would win the war. 5 months later, Lincoln promoted Grant to command all Union armies. The siege of Vicksburg didn't just open a river. It severed the Confederacy's lifeline, destroyed an irreplaceable army, and proved that the South could not hold its most strategic positions against a determined Union assault. When the white flags rose over Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, the outcome of the Civil War was no longer in doubt. The Confederacy could still fight, and it would for 2 more terrible years, but it could no longer win. The key to the war was in Union hands, and it would never be given back.